It's June 16th, 2021, and we're talking to Froskurinn about the current metagame and the balance of power in the LCS, and playing Armchair GM with some of the best players in North America. This is the True Sight Podcast. Welcome to the True Sight Podcast by Oracle's Elixir, your source for in-depth analytical coverage of League of Legends and the rest of the esports world. I'm Tim Magic Sevenhusen, and my guest on the show this week is a former LPL and LEC caster, and now a host for G4 TV, Indiana Froskurinn Black. How are you doing, Frosk?
I'm good. How are you, Tim?
Yeah, I'm doing well.
We've been chatting it up just a little bit, so it seems weird to be like, yes, we meet again for the first time.
Yes, I know. You spend 20 minutes prepping the tech setup and everything and making all this kind of small talk. And then you start the recording of the show and you pretend that you just loaded into the room together and have to say hello.
It's fine because I messed it up immediately out of the gate, so.
No, I mean, it's real. It's raw. No editing on this except for a little bit of editing when I have to fix stuff. But
it's not that type of stream, Tim.
No, we're just gonna move on, move forward. You're in LA now, right? You're still in the process of settling in, I think.
Yeah. I'm. Apologies, guys, if I seem really out of it or just tired. I'm in the middle of a move. You can see this vacant space behind me is eventually going to be my office, and I just moved to LA. I've only been here just short of a month. So I'm used to the time zone now, but the heat is unbearable. Today's supposed to be 32 Celsius.
Yeah, that's pretty hot. It's nice and comfy. We actually, so I'm up in Pacific Northwest, kind of west coast of Canada, and we've dipped it almost into the 30s once back in May, and it was pretty wild. Which for the Fahrenheit listeners, what is that, 85, 90?
It's hot.
It's hot.
It's supposed to be 104 today, I think.
What?
Yeah.
Oh no, that's hotter than a hot tub. So
that's
actually my reference point is my parents have a hot tub, and so I spend a lot of time in that as a teenager, and I know exactly what 100 degrees Fahrenheit feels like. So.
Yes, hotter than a hot tub outside.
Not good. You've been doing some a bunch of different transitions. You moved into this role with G4. What's that been like for you compared to what you've been doing the last few years?
Completely different. I was having this conversation with my wife where I was basically like, it's super surreal to have a schedule that's Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, as opposed to A, working weekends, and then also B, being kind of responsible to the constant evolving, changing game that is League of Legends, and just kind of refocus back on performance and comedy. And it's kind of the first time that I've done it in my adult life, because I've been working for Riot for 7 years now. A very long time, and I'm going to say it felt really good. I really miss League of Legends, and I do have some content coming out with the LCS probably later this week, so I still dip back into it when I can, because it's just the game that I love, but I'm not gonna lie, it is really nice not to be responsible for League of Legendos and to actually have fun with the game again.
Yeah, that's always a big difference, right? When something that you're passionate about or as a hobby turns into your full-time job, or the thing that you spend all the time. It doesn't necessarily mean you stop loving it, but you just lose the ability to just purely enjoy it on its own merits, right?
It was also, really messed up in terms of my relationship with the game and the community and kind of getting out of it. Me and my wife were literally just talking about this. We're just you don't realize that you're being essentially bullied or going through a really toxic work environment for 7 years until you're on the other side of it. She's like, wow, your mental health has been just so much better since we've moved to California. So it honestly is very surreal to feel like you've kind of lifted back the curtain of depression and you've finally seen the other side.
Yeah, no, I've definitely I can not, obviously not the same experiences, but similar kind of things of being in whether it's a work environment or just a life environment where things are a certain way. I was working with a company in Germany for 2.5 years where I had to wake up at 6 or 5:30 every morning and try to sync up my time, and it was just I had a lot more responsibilities for other people and stuff like that too, like, you know, working as a boss as opposed to just doing my own stuff, different levels of stress. And coming out of that, you just realize like, boy, that was, you know, some people that really fits for them, and for me that wasn't a good fit, and it just kind of drags you down a little bit. That,
I think
and
there was a stat that I saw on Reddit the other day that was basically like 40%, something ridiculous, of like workers are considering quitting their current
whoa,
job because like the pandemic has shown, you know, we need to reevaluate obviously like certain levels of privilege, like if you were able to keep a job during a pandemic versus losing your job during the pandemic. But for those who moved into like a remote capacity where we're basically like, you know, this work-life balance isn't what I want, and it has almost like reprogrammed people. So I'm really interested to see kind of what the good that can come out of the pandemic will be, rather than just the bad, and how it hopefully will kind of retrain or reshift and restructure our work-life balance situation, at least in the States.
Yeah, I'm hopeful for that as well. So let's get into some of the stuff we want to talk about, because we are here to talk about League of Legends and esports and all of that. And I think an interesting place to start is just some of the comments I've been seeing about the metagame that we're in right now. Obviously, you know, we've got picks like I did a Reddit video last week about Gwen and Viego being new champions that affect things, and stuff gets warped around that. And I think one of the really interesting aspects of the meta we're in is just the amount of flexibility within it. And I think with both of those champions being, you know, theoretically triple flex picks, you could put a lot of champions on the list of, in theory, they could be flexed, but, you know, whether they actually do is a separate question. But I guess in general, how do you feel about kind of the meta we're in? Do you like what we're seeing? Do you think it's you know, an entertaining meta?
I do think it's an entertaining meta. I think when people are having meta discussions, it's everyone will almost define it slightly differently, because it's kind of like how people view what controls the meta. Do you believe that the meta is defined by the champions that are being played in it? Do you believe that the meta is being defined by the best way to make gold, or the best items? You know what I mean? Like there will always be something that the strongest thing that people want to manipulate, and then the meta kind of funnels in after that. You know, when we had mages in the bot lane, it was because the mage itemization was so much cheaper and more effective than the AD carry itemization, and then suddenly you have mages or non-traditional ADCs that are down there, and then the meta becomes warped around that. And right now I think the meta is still fairly warped around, at least in North America. Dragon stacking, I think, is super important. And it's not that I think that, I personally don't believe that dragon stacking is as strong as teams seem to value it for how much they will throw themselves at that dragon pit. But at least in the LCS, that seems to be one of the primary and most important win conditions, which then means that your meta is going to be centered around having a really strong either 2v2 bot lane or 2v2 mid jungle and having river control. And so that's how I look at the meta. So right now in the LCS, I'm like, the meta is very fast paced. It's very much about dragon stacking. I think that LCS teams care more about Rift Herald than I've seen in LPL and things like that. Like monster objectives seem to be rather important, rather than kind of like side lane setup or different setups and how they're creating picks. It feels like in LCS that you kind of dance around until the timer comes up that Herald or Dragon are in play, and then you have like these big team fights that run into each other. I do think that anytime team fighting is a core part of the game, that the game is at its most fun to watch, because that's when all the players get to interact. So the more team fighting and skirmishes there are in League of Legends, I think the better that the game is for viewership in general.
Yeah, you know, it's different when you have the fans able to watch the team fights, as opposed to the other side of the appreciation when coaches and analysts are getting to be excited about, oh, they left this many minions alive in that way, which means they get to have this tempo and rotate there, and like you have to go and all like, hold on, okay, that's just not so much fun for the general people. But you know, I think the focus on neutral objectives, how much do you think that comes from the influence of coaches over the way the teams play, as opposed to the influence of the players? You know, the kind of the balance in that, because I guess like what I would put out there is that in a league where the coaches have more influence and like get to dictate the way you play, you can have a lot more set plays or set rotations or things like that for the objectives, and the objectives might increase in value. But maybe I'm just pulling that out of nowhere, and I don't really know LPL coaching that well.
So what do I think? How's the nicest way to say this? I forget who said it. I think it was Amazing, or maybe it was Febiven. It was in the LEC during an interview, and the statement basically was that League of Legends has been out for so long that the game has kind of been figured out on a fundamental or basic level, and that there's like a formula that goes to it. You know, the first thing that you do is you get the dragon, and then when that timer's down, you can play towards the top side of the map, and how you, you know, the mid tower is kind of the most important, although now people can get into like really deep conversations of, well, maybe you leave the mid tower up because then you have a centralized place to farm, you know, like those. But in general, it's first you take the dragon. Then you can play top side. The most important tower is going to be the mid tower because it gives you the most control over the enemy jungle. Then you can swing out into top, and it's a formula that people have figured out. And I think that we've seen that kind of spread over everywhere, where every team has like a basic fundamental understanding, which is why when I say that the LCS seems to be really concerned with dragon stacking, not only do I think that dragon stacking is powerful, but the fact is that it's almost the most basic way to play League of Legends, where you're just in the back of your mind like, okay, every X minutes I am going to walk up to this dragon pit and I need to make sure that I have my reset 45 to 30 seconds before then, and I know that I want to place my triangle vision behind it, and this is when we sweep in.
Mid-prio, all that kind
exactly,
of,
but the thing is that now then you start to see like the really big gap between the players or the teams that kind of understand, well, if we know exactly what you're going to do. Mid-prio is a perfect example. You know that everyone who comes up to the dragon, like if I'm against an LCS team, I'm just sitting there, I'm like, okay, guys, they're going to come mid and they're going to hard push. So what we're going to do is we're going to stand just in fog of war outside of mid, and we're going to throw an Ash Arrow, we're going to throw a Sejuani ult, whatever it is, we're going to snap grab them on this wave, because you know that they just autopilot into, I have to push mid wave to get mid prio, and then I can walk into river. And the enemy team's just going to be like, they're going to push mid wave, and we're going to snap grab them. And then suddenly this team fight that LCS was setting up for, they're now at a 4v5 disadvantage, or maybe like a 2v5 disadvantage. And
you just, you kind of, you cut the corner on the play and you make it happen 20 seconds faster than they think, because you're following the playbook and then the other person's playing ahead of the playbook, right? They're playing counter playbook. So yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that.
And so I just think that in terms of coaching, kind of like wrapping it back around there, like I definitely think it was good because I was having a conversation with Darshan and Raz and Medios and Kaizen about kind of the importance of coaching in LCS and like how it's maturing and how it's changing the league and like the academy system. And all of us agreed that things are getting better, but there's still like a long way to go. And that if you really do want to see improvement from the LCS, and the improvement will always be in the context of international results, because that seems to be that all the fans care about. But it's about learning how to practice more efficiently. And Darshan brought up the really good point that, you know, we're trained in League of Legends to just grind solo queue. You know, that's how we probably start playing the game, and then you get up to Grandmaster Challenger, and then you get good enough to try to go pro, and you only know that I need to sit here and play League of Legends for 16 hours a day to get that serotonin boost of plus 20 LP, but you don't ever think I need to go into practice tool and I need to work for 30 minutes on my Jace combos, or I need to just, you know, figure out these waves, or just focus on if I want to have this type of wave control or how to manipulate these waves correctly. And so, you know, you can spend 16 hours a day and burn out your players just by having them grind everything and not taking in as much information as if you spent, you know, really 2 focused hours just training one thing.
Yeah. And I think the different kinds of like, call them both practice, right? But those different types have different kind of reward structures. And some of them are explicit and some of them are implicit. Like if you play solo queue, like you're saying, you can see yourself climbing the ladder, or maybe not, but hopefully you are. Whereas if you're doing other kinds of things, even something like VOD review, right, or like watching pro views or stream views of pros that are better than you, you know, you don't have an obvious kind of progression metric that comes along with that. And it's actually really interesting, and I'm definitely not the person to have this conversation in more depth, but having spoken to like psychologists, for example, and talking about, say, child psychology and the way that children have certain kinds of play that are more beneficial to them and help them mature in better ways. And the ways that the things that help them mature are these kind of free play, imaginative things that have no internal reward structures. Whereas if they go and they play video games or something like that have anything that shows you victory or defeat at the end of it, that can help them with certain things, but it doesn't help them psychologically mature, because they are having a direct chemical feedback of, you know, that dopamine boost or whatever it's going to be when you have a win. And I wonder how much of that applies. I'd have to speak to somebody who's like an expert in that space, but I wonder how much of that applies to kind of some of the stuff you're talking about, is the ways of improving that don't have do whatever it is and get the kind of, you know, get the carrot at the end of the stick at the end when you're done. But
it's learning how to learn.
sure.
I talk about this with Deficio all the time, that, you know, you always have that big stretch of break between splits, and then you come back in and all the teams suck. And they'll always say it, like spring split, every interview with every pro player, they'll be like, yeah, everyone sucks right now. And it's because you're only learning through grinding and repetition, and like kind of just trying to stay on top of the meta. And it's such an intense game. I think burnout is a really big issue for League of Legends pros comparatively to any other title, because League of Legends is constantly evolving and changing into a different game so quickly, versus even if you have meta or adjustments and things like CSGO, you know, the gun will still aim the same. You learn the spray pattern, and you don't have to. And so I think that we'll always see turnover and burnout in League pros more so than any other esport. But you have to teach people, have to figure out how to teach people how to learn and how to unlock players, which is why I also think that roster swaps or changing out players for a short-term game is fine, but it just always bites everyone in the ass in terms of long-term gain, where you're just inheriting all these new problems. And they do it because no one has figured out how to unlock a player. If a player is capable of playing at 100, but right now they're only hitting a 60, no one's figured out how to unlock that 40, so the only option that they have is they can look at the player who's already unlocked the 80. And even if that player only goes to a 90, so theoretically this 60 player can get to 100, the teams will take the 80 every single time. And it's just really unfortunate. And I think that's kind of the cycle that especially the LCS is really stuck in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's what they're trying to break out of so much this year with all of the changes with the proving ground system, and you can see that certain orgs are trying to break that cycle, but it's definitely a challenging thing to overcome. Speaking about kind of the meta and the changes within it, and the fact that the game is changing, the way the teams themselves, I think, are always changing kind of what works for them, what fits their playstyle and their players and things like that. How do you approach prep when you're coming into, like, say you're doing it for a cast or some other context, or working with a team, prepping for the way teams approach these metas, drafts and things like that? Do you have any certain or ways that you would prep for those things?
So I personally think that in majority of teams, like obviously if you get to like the top 1%, then your prep can really change, because the teams are teaching you the game. But there's a lot of, to be frank, there's a lot of times when you're watching, especially lower tier teams, where you're like, there's communication problems here. Like you can see some of the flaws, and I think a lot of that prep is often going with evaluating where you think the individual skill expression is for the specific players, and then a lot of draft analysis and champion pool analysis. And then I don't think that you have to go much farther past that. Like people will, you'll take the general of they play through the top side of the map, or they like to do this type of thing, or this support player really likes to roam here at these specific times. Like you'll pick up on those trends. But a lot of time I will go into Leaguepedia or Games of Legends or Oracle's Elixir, and I'll check the draft stats, and I'll just start looking for trends. And it's funny, Crepo actually taught me this, and he taught me how to VOD review much better. And instead of VOD reviewing like an entire game, especially if you have to for international events, usually you don't watch those teams, like especially when I was doing the LPL, I didn't have time to watch the LCS. So when I'm prepping for Worlds or MSI, I basically have to wait until the seed is selected, if it's going to be Cloud9 or TL, and then I go and binge all of their VODs. But instead of watching the entire VOD all the way through, you pick a certain section that you want to cover. So Crepo was like, let's figure out how C9's early game works. And you literally just watch the first 15 minutes of all of their VODs, and you just, you're not stopping and pausing and thinking about it too much. You're just kind of like the reflex of what are the things that you're noticing, what are the patterns, what are the trends, and then having a conversation. And then you can go and check the stats. And we've worked with the league system for so long that we know that there are certain stats that will show up if we have certain perceptions or analysis about things. Like I'll try to think of a clear example. One that will always come up in all of our stat meetings will be like, this player's damage per minute or whatever is really not great, so we don't think he's very good. And then if we have an opinion that that player is actually really good, we'll be like, yeah, but that's probably because he's playing tank champions, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And then they'll go and they'll cross right. But these are the things that the stats team can miss because they're only looking at it from a numbers perspective rather than the analysis and then finding the numbers that back it up. So sometimes those things can happen, which is why I think entirely relying on stats can be really dangerous because then you kind of miss like the full bigger picture. But I really recommend that for VOD reviewing, especially if people want to get better at their understanding of the game. Instead of trying to take in again, it's like what we just said, very focused learning. Instead of trying to take in the full hour of the game, just focus on 15 minutes. Maybe you just want to see how Cloud9 team fight. So you literally just go to 25 minutes and you just watch every single team fight in multiple different VODs. Maybe you're only focusing on how they're like peeling or tanking, like their tank line. And then you get to have those little nuggets of, Cloud9 team fighting versus this team. I just don't think they're going to be able to match up because unless this player's on this champion, they just can't, they don't know how it works or how to set up a team fight. And then when that comes to fruition and cast, then you get to feel like a genius. You're like, boom, right there. And instead of spending 8 hours watching all of these VODs, you spent maybe 2 hours just watching 40 team fights.
Yeah. Well, and I think that speaks to a couple of things. One is being targeted or being like goals oriented in your VOD review or your prep in general, right? Like don't just passively, okay, pick a game, put it on and then see what happens and react to it, right? Like know what you're watching for and pay attention to it. So think about it in advance before your review. And that's been a really important thing in what I've had to learn about VOD review as well, is being intentional about the way you review these things. And I think that's super important. And the other one is, just like not like you said, I think not letting the stats dictate your perceptions of things. Use them to contextualize, because I think so much of your ability to evaluate this stuff comes down to your quality as an analyst, your level of understanding of what you're seeing. When you are watching these things and you're recording observations, so like I've shared before, I take a ton of notes while I'm watching games. I almost play-by-play the games as I'm watching them, unless there's nothing going on. But the quality of those notes, when I go back and review them later, the quality of those notes is entirely based on the quality of my observations. If I have a bad read of what I'm seeing and I take that note down, then later I'm going to come back to that note and I'm going to trust it. But if it was wrong, then then my later review is going to be wrong. And so, improving yourself as kind of the research instrument is the way I tend to look at it from kind of a social science background. The quality of yourself as a research instrument drastically affects the quality of the observations you're going to bring together. So a lot of those things, I think, definitely fit with things that I've had to learn along the years as well.
Yeah, and, it's also interesting then because it's kind of like, how do you, in the same way that we're talking about like players kind of learning like I have an animation background, and so this will all fit together, I promise. They teach you to learn pen and paper first because obviously the tools will constantly be changing. So as soon as you learn like the base building blocks of like the mechanics of how things work, then it's just about relearning the tool because you already understand the fundamentals. Yep. And I think in the same way that we're talking about players, like League of Legends has been figured out on a fundamental level, and now it's kind of like the tools are changing, and so how quickly can you learn those new tools to spice up the fundamentals? In terms of if people want to become analysts or they want to learn how to VOD review, it's kind of always going back to the fundamentals of when you are learning from a team, when you're watching their VOD, to do it, like you're saying, very intentionally, but also just like in the early times, like now, we can get through VODs like very quickly. There's not like a lot of stop and start because you've trained how to think that fast. But like, feel free to slam on your space bar and just always constantly be asking. The two questions that you should ask is, what is this player thinking? And predict what's going to happen. And then if you find that your predictions of what's about to happen start coming true more and more often, then you're putting your mind in the right spot. And if it doesn't come true, then go back and ask yourself why. What did you miss? And if you just train that over and over, eventually then you'll be able to go through very quickly, be like, okay, yeah, the camps have respawned, the jungler's going to move here, this wave's being shoved in, so they're probably going to look for a gank here. And even if the gank doesn't happen, if you see the jungler come around going for the gank, you already knew that you were in the player's mind of, okay, he looked for the gank, they probably said, no, they needed item, yeah, they're going to go back, yeah, he wanted the item. They thought that they communicated that there was a potential for a gank, but someone was like, no, I'd rather get this.
Yeah. Well, in that process of, taking a game state and trying to say, here's what I think should happen next, or what they should do, or what they're going to do, and then seeing whether it happens or not is a really fun one. And I've done this in the past with calling them analyst challenges on Twitter, share a little video clip or a screenshot or whatever, and try to say what should happen next. But that process is a really super valuable. And then it gets really tricky into the points when like they don't do what you think, and then you have to decide, were you right or were they right? And then, hopefully you can start to figure that out, and then you try to get opinions from other people. And sometimes when I do those analyst challenges and I get coaches either privately or publicly, sharing those, and I get to learn from them and go, okay, I thought I had it. Actually, I was wrong in this case. And that could be a really great learning opportunity as well. So it's always a good way to approach things. I understand you've been doing some work around, speaking of predicting what teams are going to do or things like that, some work around like draft analytics and things like that of your own. Do you want to talk about that?
So hopefully I'll be able to release it sometime this year. I'm hoping before the end of the split, but back in the LPL days, before the LPL was taken over by Riot, Kelsey would keep very intense stats and records on the LPL that would mean that we had to go through and manually count things, like when wards were placed, when dragons were taken, if a team had Baron vision when the Baron was taken, like these types of things, and just manually track them in spreadsheets. And so you're combing through VODs to grind that, whereas now there's so many automated systems that can do those types of things.
Some of those things, yeah.
Yeah, the one that I've always wanted, that I've been trying to figure out how to get to work in the LEC for a really long time, is things like counter picks and draft analysis. Because as as someone who has worked in the analyst scene, at least for the broadcast and then behind scenes for some teams, the thing that you always want is you want like to be able to print off and then to see what a team, what their champion pools are, what they like to pick, where they like to pick it, and like what kind of counter champions that they have. And there's no automated system right now that does that very well. So I've been going through and manually taking draft order, who's winning, what patch it's on, what side, where the champions end up, and then trying to define the champions into specific buckets. That and this is where it can get really messed up, of using my analytical brain and not the stat brain to be like, this champion counters this champion for this reason, so I'm going to put this in a bucket and try to link them through the data. So that way, hopefully once I'm done taking all of this data for LEC and LCS, that I can have, Team Liquid print out results on blue 1, percentage chance, these are the 3 champions that will probably come up. If this is banned, this champion will come up. They counter with this champion, they counter with this position X number percentage of times. So that's the goal right now, that hopefully once it's done I can release that, and that will feel good, because that's something that I've been chasing forever.
Yeah, I think a lot of people look at draft analytics as a big opportunity space, because as opposed to anything that happens in game, there's always so much context. But draft is something that, it plays out the same every time, right? You pick and then 2 picks, and like the structure of it is always the same. Something can lead into another thing, and you don't have to say, there's no gold advantage in a draft where, they made this play because they were 10k gold up, so that play is not the same as the one they made if they're 1k gold up. Like all these different things of nuance, and so draft seems like it should be a place where you can start to make some predictive work and start to outthink the opponent. And it is such a little game in and of itself. So it sounds like, the system you're working on could be pretty interesting, and you've definitely got the expertise to avoid some of the traps that people fall into in that space, where they let just the numbers try to figure it out, and they just go straight off win rates and stuff like that, as opposed to like actually understanding, does this champion actually counter that champion, in what way? So the subject matter expertise is, I think, sometimes missing when people try to approach this area.
And it's hard to find that information. I wish that there was a site that I could go to and just be like, Gwyn. Which teams banned this champion on blue side? Like something as simple as that, and then just have like the list come up, and then you're like, oh, I see someone hasn't gotten their Gwyn practice in.
Yeah. Well, we'll definitely stay tuned and see if you're able to get that finished up and release it, because it sounds like it could be pretty cool. Why don't we dig into some more specific things? We've been talking about kind of very general kind of metagame and the ways to approach things. Why don't we jump into some actual LCS topics, if you're prepared for that? And I think the big story of the LCS to me so far this summer has been 100 Thieves and Abbedagge coming in. Or Abbedagge, I think you guys always said in LEC, but for some reason the LCS casters are all saying Abbedagge. I don't know.
It's the sound that a little person from Age of Empires makes when you move them.
Oh, yeah.
They go Abbedagge.
Abbedagge.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
That's where his name comes from.
I am old enough to remember that, and I actually had heard that before, but I totally forgot. So, Age of Empires, good stuff. Age of Empires 4 is coming out soonish, I think. So, what do you think of that move? What do you think of 100 Thieves so far, and are they, as impressive as a lot of people seem to think they are?
So, I'll just what I think is really interesting about the move is actually also the behind mechanics of the move. And I'll just state this very clearly, that this is coming from a bystander. I don't know the actual numbers or mechanics that went, so this is all allegedly, but through conversations that I've been absorbing and watching the space, it's been known for a while that Schalke were going to sell their LEC spot. Other orgs are also looking to sell, but you can't sell at the same time when one person is selling, because then it's just the lowest bidder. So
yeah,
I wonder who. But when an org is selling, then you're going to be offloading players. I feel how to say this nicely. Schalke had 2 miracle runs, kind of back to back, where they sucked for half the split.
Yeah.
And obviously that's not saying that Abba sucked for half the split and then was good. I think out of all of the pieces on Schalke, he was probably one of the most consistent and one of the most valuable. Mm-hmm. But there was a lot of conversation happening around that because Schalke made this crazy miracle run, that it was almost like the recency bias effect, where if you're in the middle of that split and Schalke are just not getting it together, you're probably thinking how do I rip this roster apart? What do I do to change all of these things? And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe internally they're just we're so close to greatness. Maybe they knew that they were gonna go the distance. But from everything else, I'm how are you gonna fix that roster? And then they make it, and then suddenly they're we don't need to fix the roster. In fact, sign all these guys again. Sign them for more. And I'm just ooh, were you convinced by your miracle run that you didn't need to fix your roster? Which one is true, the miracle run or the the performance? Which I guess now, because they did it twice, they can say, the miracle run was true. I have my doubts.
Yeah.
But I think that player value got overinflated because of kind of the hype that was surrounding the roster. And I think especially when it comes to 100 Thieves, it felt like you failed 2 times in a row to make Worlds, and so it was kind of find the emergency button to slap down and figure out how to fix this, and you grab someone like Abbedagge, who is a good player, but I'm imagining the money that he went for, especially because of some of the numbers that I've heard come out of LCS, I'm that's not worth it. Parks wasn't worth that money. Abbedagge is definitely not gonna be worth that. But oh my god, what are you guys doing? And it is paying off right now. But my only concern is that Abbedagge was a really good Akali player always, and Akali is, I guess, in meta right now for LCS. And so he's had 2 Akali games. No, he's had 2 Karma games, some Akali games, and I think
Karmas,
an Orianna in there.
Yeah.
And my only concern is that when the meta shifts, if Abbedagge will continue to be the Akali god or Karma god that he's now been to be seen as. And that sounds rude of me to put all this thing and be Abbedagge. It's no, Abba is he's a very good player. I think his Lissandra is one of the best Lissandras that we've ever seen in LEC. So if Lissandra ever comes back into meta, let me tell you, this guy is a god tier Lissandra. And his Akali is very good, but do I think that any player is worth the amount of money that the LCS has been reportedly throwing at these players? Absolutely not. I've been doing a lot. It's interesting with G4. I'm about to release because we want to do like more like John Oliver style content where it's
Okay.
like really well researched, very long
Yeah.
form content. And I feel so bad because I did an interview with Kelsey like 2 months ago, but we've just been like re-research. It's coming, Kelsey. I promise. We just haven't gotten to release it yet. But I did like super in depth with the esports bubble and like, does it actually exist in LoL esports? How does it work? All of the mechanics there. And I really do feel that esports, especially in North America, needs to go through a contracting phase. And it needs to get smaller. And unfortunately, the people who will be on the chopping block for that most are the players. And like, I want the players to get their bread. Like, good for ABBA, good for Perks, get that money. Like, that is ultimately the owner's fault. But I'm also looking at the owners like, what are you doing? We do not make that type of money. And pretending that we do and trying to bankroll onto an investor's vanity project. It's just like, it's ridiculous to me. And then TSM comes in and they come in with like a $210 million cryptocurrency. I'm just like, oh no. So.
Yeah, no, it is interesting because I think people have been saying for a few years now that esports was due for, for the bubble to pop a little bit and to have a course correction. And yet it keeps getting bigger and bigger. And you go, oh boy, that's just setting up. It's like being on the West Coast, earthquake style. The longer between
plates.
the earthquakes, the tectonic plates get more and more pressure on them. And eventually it's just going to be bigger when it does release. We haven't had a big one here in a long time. So
the concern is, and for like the viewers, just to like explain it very simply, big teams, and you'll notice this, just keep your eyes open of what teams seem to announce like different sponsorships or different deals every 2 years. It's often going to be the big spender teams. And like, yeah, it goes into itself that when you're winning, you can be a big spender team and then you get like more and more. So of course more brands are going to be attached to it. But that's the ultimate way that people make money, that no one is making money off of their League of Legends competitive team. It does not happen. It is not happening. Like 50% of income, I think TSM reported before they got the cryptocurrency push by FTX in the Forbes article was from their Blitz app. And then 100 Thieves came out and said that majority of their income or their revenue is being made off of things outside of the competitive sphere, so things like influencers, which is why teams are signing different streamers or different personalities, because that makes money. The players themselves do not make money. And they need to then find different investors to turn over. But I think one of the big pressures on the import rule was because the salaries have gotten out of control. And so if you have more people competing for the position, it can drive down player price, which is a huge cost saver because that's going to be the number one, I guess, export for money going out, it is getting players to be cheaper, which is unfortunate because I want the players to make good money. But I think that right now it's a bit ridiculous and we're playing like we're traditional sports.
Yeah, you also want the industry to last so they can keep getting money for longer. So more now or more for less for longer.
Don't get me wrong, this isn't only the org's fault, because I feel like everyone is like really jumping on the org. This is also Riot's fault. Like, what the fuck? Sorry, I can't curse. Kit Kat's your sponsor. It's 6 years and you just now have banners in the game, and then you have to think about when do the sponsors actually get visibility on the stream. For LEC, the team sponsors will be when they have an interview, and then they have like a top third that's, we'll say like Razer, Alienware, whatever. But then you're also competing with the brand space that Riot's personal sponsors will get, and the fact that there aren't any media rights. I think the closest thing that we have to that is like Overwatch with the YouTube deal. But when you look at traditional sports like the Premier League, majority of their money are made off of media rights. And because Riot and Blizzard wanted to keep their development in-house and then build out these studios, and because Twitch is like they control everything since there's no competing streaming platform, it's really messed up the ecosystem. So this isn't only on LCS orgs spending ridiculous amounts of money. This is also on the developers deciding that they wanted to keep things in-house as opposed to the LPL system, which for a long time wasn't run by Riot, was run by competing production companies who would then pay Riot to have the rights, and then the multiple streaming companies, because China is set up in a completely different ecosystem, to broadcast it. That was like the closest, and that's why China is such a healthier ecosystem in terms of the esports teams actually making money. And part of the reason is because of the multiple competing streaming platforms, which then actually create broadcast rights or media rights, which is how traditional sports actually make money.
Yeah, that, and I mean the size of the audience helps with them as well, but the amount you monetize per audience member is still, I think helped by their structure for sure. So I mean, to bring this back to kind of the 100 Thieves.
Sorry, we were talking about
no,
analysis,
I mean,
and I'm like, but the media rights.
to bring it back to Abbedagge and 100 Thieves. So it sounds like you potentially have an issue with kind of the amount they paid to bring him in. You know, whether or not this was an efficient move. In terms of just the on the Rift performance, how do you think about? Are they justifying that spend at all, or do they look like, some people would look at them and say they're the best team in the LCS right now, or at least top 2 with Cloud9? Do you feel the same as that?
Yeah, I saw Jack's tweet being like, it's super cool to be a 100 Thieves fan. This is the best the roster has ever looked. I'm like, ooh, ouch. How to say this nicely? 100 Thieves need to make Worlds. That's where a majority of the money is recouped because the audience numbers are that much larger. So when you're making content, and you can go through and you can see this on every team's content. Normal split, Splice is a perfect example. Splice, before they make Worlds, no one's watching their content. Nothing is happening. As soon as they make Worlds, boom, the numbers start popping off. So making Worlds isn't just important from a competitive aspect. It's so important to the teams actually getting effort versus value off of the content
Building
that they're
your
making.
brand.
That's why it's important. Exactly. So in spending this money, if 100 Thieves don't make Worlds, it is absolutely not worth it. They absolutely just tanked themselves. They have to make Worlds. Will they make Worlds? I don't think so. I think that Cloud9 will be fine. I think that TL will be fine. I think that 100 Thieves have really good individual players. I do not think that their macro game is very strong. I was watching them. It's funny. You and I were having this conversation, so you set me up. Here's your spicy thing. I think Immortals is a smarter team. I've been watching Immortals games, and I'm like, Xerxes is just jungle gapping these fools so hard. And it helps that also Xerxes is one of his best champions, is so powerful in the meta right now, and that's Rumble. And LCS players cannot play Rumble to save their lives. Oh my Lord, what are these equalizers? I'm like, oh no, it hurts. But I just look at how 100 Thieves uses tempo when they have it, and I think they use it really poorly. They do not get as much as as other teams will get done when they have. I like to think of tempo as offense versus defense, when you have the ball and you get to make the play. I feel like when 100 Thieves are given the ball, some of their players literally just throw that ball away. I'm like, what are you doing farming Krugs right now? So that's my concern. But the thing is 100 Thieves have really good players like Abbedagge, and in leagues like LEC, LCS, so this isn't just me on North America, if you have the better mechanical players, when it comes to it, you can actually just win games outright because you can lane better or you can outplay certain team fights better. So maybe that's enough for 100 Thieves. I don't think that their macro game is really strong, which is disappointing because I really liked Closer when he went over to the LCS. I haven't been keeping track of his trajectory in LCS. This is the first split where I've watched every single game and tried to really study every single game in the LCS since I'm now in the North American region. But I've just not. I'm like, what is happening? I don't know if he's uncomfortable with the champions that are in meta, or I don't know if maybe there's some communication issues with his solo laners, or what kind of kinks need to be worked out. But I think that 100 Thieves right now are really banking on their individual skill expression and the ability to outplay there rather than outthinking teams. And I think between Immortals and 100 Thieves, Immortals are the complete opposite. Xerxes is able to jungle gap so hard that he can create massive leads, but at the end of the day, Immortals also have just significantly weaker players in multiple positions. So even if I think that they're the smarter team, maybe if it really comes to it, that they just won't be able to stand up because they can't lane as well. They can't click their buttons as well.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to kind of the importance of the, like you said, the communication between the jungler and the solo lanes is a big part of it. When I only watched a few games of last year with Xerxes and Alphari on Origin, and I just could see these guys don't know what they're doing together. They don't have a plan. And I got very much of that same kind of feeling with Someday and Closer in spring. And it seems like it's improved so far this summer just enough. Not that it's good now, but it's improved just enough that they aren't throwing games actively all the time. But there's still that kind of opportunity to really refine that a lot more. And I think 100 Thieves fans can take some comfort in the fact that it's a new coach, presumably some new systems, and maybe they just need time, right? But yeah, they definitely, they have the individual player skill that you wonder whether that prevents them sometimes from seeing their own issues because they win anyways. and you wonder whether that's going to affect them, or whether they're going to compensate for that. I think you definitely have gotten teams like that so far that win too much and don't get a chance to work on themselves. What was it, the TSM team that lost like 2 or 3 games all year and then failed at Worlds? Double playing Lucian all the time. It was like 2016 or something like that, and that can definitely happen as well. But
it's positive reinforcement for the wrong reasons.
Yeah.
It's like that classic thing when you're watching a watch, you're like, no, Rift Shield right now, what are you doing? And then they get it anyway, like, but now they learn their lesson.
Yeah, that definitely comes up. As an aside, the number of opinions on the correct and incorrect ways to do Rift Herald is just so... People like to yell about Rift Herald a lot. Okay? it's there. Interesting to hear you say that you think Team Liquid is going to be fine in the context of Jenkins coming in and playing and kind of replacing Alphari so far. I think it wouldn't be much of a stretch for people to say that kind of downgrade an individual skill might knock them out of the top 3. So what are you seeing that makes you confident that they still will remain top 3?
Because I think that core JJ is just that good. I've been really impressed with, so this isn't like me saying like this will be the top 3, but just like the teams that have stood out to me that I've been impressed watching would be like, oh, there's a lot more here going on than I thought. TSM, and TSM specifically with their vision control. I think Sword Art and how he's working with the jungler. I can never say his name right. Spica is working a lot better. Like TSM's vision line, if you go back and watch their games and how they always have vision on the right spots, how they're denying vision appropriately, how they're exhausting vision for teams, I think their vision game is really solid. And I think Sword Art is either plugging in, like maybe I'm giving credit to Sword Art when it's actually like multiple other members, but their vision game is really good. So I've been liking that. I think Immortals, how they're playing around their jungle and their lanes and just like their pressure game overall through lane phase, really solid. And I think that their team fighting's better. Unfortunately, I think that their mid laner and their AD carry aren't very strong to stand up to the skill competition in the LCS, and so I think that if it's an even game, like if they don't create massive advantages in lane phase or win through like the objective game, if either having like a win condition of dragon stacking or whatever, or if Xerxes not on a champion that can really turn team fights like Rumble, like it's very easy if you don't have a great carries comparatively to your competition, if you have a really good Rumble player who could just win a team fight by themselves with like a god tier equalizer. So it'll be really interesting, like as the champions shift away and as these tools are taken away from Immortals, if then they start to be exposed because their mid laner and their AD carry aren't as experienced or can't stand up to the rest of the league of the skill of the league. And then for TL, even though they like no one is going to doubt that Alphari is like a god tier laner. That said, Alphari can be a really selfish player. And he can be unwilling to, it's weird because I don't want to badmouth Alphari because like he can definitely learn, but in watching him in the LEC, it used to be a thing that like Alphari would win lane every single time, but that didn't always translate to Origin winning the game. And obviously it's not like a one-man army, but it used to always be that if you put resources into Alphari that he couldn't figure out, and the team around him couldn't figure out how to translate that into victory. And so you could get him super far ahead and it just would mean nothing in the end. And I don't know if that was just a limitation of the top lane in general for the metas that he was playing in, or he himself as a top laner. And I've talked to like a bunch of different coaches about it. One coach had a very adamant opinion that Alphari was the problem with Origin because he was so selfish and he demanded so many resources and then didn't do anything with them and wouldn't rotate down to his team in time for team fights. And when you actually do go back and watch those Origin games, when Alphari is in the team fight on like his Aatrox, I think he's a really good team fighter on Aatrox. But when he is team fighting on things like his Ornn or Gangplank, like it's not good enough, and you wouldn't find the moments where the correct windows to move down and join with the team. So I think that there's just like this blanket idea that like Alphari is god tier at everything, when I think it's more fair to say that Alphari is mechanically super gifted, his wave control is exceptional, and his trade patterns on waves is also exceptional. Like he is a god tier laner, but there are things that do need tweaks and balances about like, is it better to have maybe Jenkins when he's called comes? It's like, hey, we got a team fight. Come here. Or
Yeah.
maybe Jenkins.
I'm going to lose a wave. Yeah, I'm going to lose a wave to run there, but hey, it's actually important to do, right? My CS
exactly. And then you win a team fight, and then suddenly, it's completely different. And these things are hard unless you're sitting in comms and you're listening to things. And that's not to say that Jenkins is a better player than Alphari, but that is to say that Jenkins might be a better player for TL than Alphari is. And I think that's the thing when you have a player as talented as Alphari and trying to get him in a system that works, because unfortunately he's been in so many tier teams. And but at the same time, then you have to kind of ask the Abbedagge question. If I'm going to be harsh on Abba, maybe I should be harsh on Alphari. If you have these really good individual performances, but all of your teams, and you've been on multiple different teams, just can't stand the distance, then maybe it's also something like you're putting into the space.
Yeah, unfortunately, and I'd like to see him succeed because he does have so much skill. But TL are now running with Jenkins. They announced a new, at least temporary academy top laner. They brought in Dokla, who's been around for a while. They announced most recently that Alphari is kind of taking some time away, and then there's some kind of like personal factors involved in this. So we'll see whether he ends up playing for Team Liquid again or not. It's pretty hard to tell right now. Or I don't think they know the future of that either. But I think Jenkins has been acquitting himself reasonably well, especially given like what expectations might have been coming in and like what he's having to live up to. So I agree. I think Team Liquid, maybe they'll end up going in third instead of second now, but I think they can definitely still be top three if things do click.
I don't think you need a good top laner in LCS. I think that the top laners in this region are really, really weak, which is why I think Alphari really got to just like beat around. Like he's an exceptional world-class top laner, but also I'm like, you don't need a good top laner to win LCS. I think you need if you have the better jungler and the better bot lane, I think that's how you can actually win this region.
I think the top laners in LCS, their strengths are much more in non-laning things. The top laners that are good are usually good at team fighting, or they're good at weak siding, or they're good at these kinds of things. But I definitely agree there aren't really good laning top laners in the LCS outside of Alphari. So
I think Fudge on specific champions. I will say this: I completely misread Fudge. I was like not about Oceanic players being in the like LEC and LCS. And especially, I know people will like bring up FBI, but it's like that's the only one that you have right now. But after Fudge had his pop-off performance on an international stage, I'm like, okay, I misjudged Fudge.
Yeah, I'm the captain of the Fudge hype tree. Have been for a while. So I'm very glad to hear you say that. We've been going long on a couple of these topics, so let's jump into something fun for a minute here. Last night, I tweeted out an Armchair GM kind of a game where I took 6 players per position from the LCS, or in some cases just outside of the LCS, put some salaries on them, and gave people an $18 salary cap, and gave you the opportunity to come up with your own on this. So since people might not be able to see this, and I didn't take the time to prep to put it on screen, and it'd be an audio only version and stuff like that, I don't want to take the time to run through every single name in there. But do you want to take a second to say what team you would have come up with based on the structure that it was? And I'll put a link to the source tweet in the show notes for this as well. People want to go and look it up and play it, kind of play the game themselves.
Yeah, I did Impact, Xerxes, Jizuke, King, and Core JJ.
Ooh.
And I still have $1 left, and so I said that I'm hiring a content manager.
So this is good. So Impact was the $4 top laner. Xerxes was the $4 jungler. Jizuke was the $2, and I had more expensive than him. I had Perks, Abbedagge, Power Vival, and Jensen. And this is one that, when I set this up and put the salaries on players, I tried to put players lower if I thought they were kind of underrated or underappreciated by the community. And I think this is a case where I priced Jizuke where I thought people would want to spend for him, not what I think of him. And then you said King is the bot laner. He's the $1 bot laner. Much more stronger example of what I was just saying than even Jizuke is. And Core JJ. So what's the justification for going a $1 bot laner and a $6 support here?
I really think that highly of Core JJ. I think that he is a top 5 support in the world. I think that he is the best player that North America has seen for a very long time. Mm-hmm. He's so good. So if I had to like really spin, like if I'm looking at Alphari, Blabber, Perks, FBI, Core, JJ, I'm like, if you have a god tier ADC, like Uzi didn't win a domestic title forever. Like he finally won MSI, didn't even win Worlds. It doesn't matter if you have a god tier ADC if you have a pretty tier surrounding cast. And I didn't think that Perks was worth that money. I don't think that Blabber in this meta is worth that money. I don't think that Alphari is worth that money because I don't think that you can win through top. And so I was like, Core JJ is the most expensive player that I'm grabbing. And then I started looking for players that I thought were really underrated or like good budget buys.
Underpriced, yeah.
Exactly. And so I immediately saw Xerxes. I think I looked at Dardoch initially, but I think that Rumble is a stronger champion than Dardoch's Lee Sin in jungle as opposed to in solo lane. And I wanted the Rumble god because Rumble's just like so potent and powerful. But I've also been really impressed with Dardoch. That's the other thing. So I was watching a lot of Dig games and I'm like, oh boy, Dig are really stupid, but I really love them. Like, I love how from the hip they are. They are such a, there is no forethought. There is no planning. There is, let's mess this guy up. Let's do it right now. But some of the skill expression, especially from Dardoch, I'm like, this is exciting. I like this team. It's really unfortunate that sometimes it just goes super sideways. They're going to be a team that's like super feast or famine. Like when they win, they will win in style. And when they lose, oh my God, will they be running it down?
Yeah, I think a lot of people put Dardoch in their lineups in this because he was the $2 jungler, and people just see that as good value. Jizuke, as we said, is the $2 mid laner here, and I see almost nobody responding. It's had like 500 responses at this point, which is way more than I expected. But scrolling through them, I see very little or almost no Jizuke in this. Why do you think that is, and why did you go with him?
I don't know. I think that there's kind of been memes that Jizuke will like run it down mid, which he absolutely will. But like Jizuke is so good, like mechanically just really good. And I know people will like bring up his pro view where he did his stupid little Lee Sin thing where he wanted to go back to the ward and then he messed it up because Lulu was like, I won't say that. Get messed up. Which like can happen because I think there's like an ego, there's a hyphiness to Jizuke. But when it's a really serious game, Jizuke has shown to be a world-class mid laner. You know, like he went to Worlds. They took down RNG. His Rise has single-handedly 1v9 won games. If Rise ever comes back into meta, Jizuke is a god. Mechanically very gifted, very smart about the game. I think performs really well under pressure, and he's just waiting for his Tristana is still really good. Like some of the games that they've played, and then just how he his rotations, his lane assignments, because he is really good at side laning. Jizuke actually reminds me a lot of Xiaohu. And that Xiaohu's biggest strength is I think he always understands where he needs to go for pressure on side lanes. And I think Jizuke also has a really good understanding of that. And we haven't gotten to really see that from Jizuke since he's been in the LCS because side laning really hasn't been a thing. It's been much more about the team fights, about the dragons, about the barons, because those monster objectives have been so powerful. But with changes to itemization, where split pushing may become more viable with the new items that Riot are bringing in, I think Jizuke is going to pop off. I think he's so underrated. This guy is so good, even if he just has some stupid moments sometimes. Like, if that worked, you'd be like, oh my God, this god. It's so clear what he's thinking. It's not like you're like, Jizuke, what are you doing? You knew exactly what he was doing.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting what the perception is of him, because it really seems like people seize onto mistakes much more firmly than they do onto successes. And like it seems like Jizuke could make 9 great plays and then one like big int, and people will say he's terrible. And I don't think that's fair at all, right? Like compared to the player who makes he plays just as many games and makes 1 good play and no ints. Is that the player you want? Like, but in all they remember is the 1 good play, like some big Azir ult or something, and then they don't realize. But that player's kind of not doing anything the rest of the time. They're just standing in the back line and autoing. Like, so yeah, I've campaigned quite a bit against the perception of Jizuke out there, and you see when I play these games and stuff, I very often will have Jizuke in my stuff, and people will get mad at me about it, and I don't know. I think he's good.
Jizuke is really good. He's much better than I think a lot of people have perception of some of the top mid laners in LCS.
Yeah. And then what about King? Because I've had a couple people, like King is another player who shows up in very few of these, and I've had a couple people be like, you have King at $1? How is that okay? Like, why isn't he in every single lineup? And yet people don't seem to have picked up on my hype of him over the past year and a half.
I think so. I haven't watched enough of King to have like the strongest opinion of him. From what I've seen of like the 80 carries listed here, which to read off the list is King, Raze, Tactical, Neo, Sven, and FBI, and that's from lowest to most. So like Tactical being at $3, I think is probably like the best bang for the buck. But I think that the slight difference between Tactical and King in terms of like performance that you're gonna get out for like bang of the buck is just like so negligible for the role itself right now that I'm just like, that's fine. uh, so I'll be honest. I think the LCS has a really big issue where no one can really play Rumble in the league outside of very few players, and I think no one can play Kai'Sa in this league outside of no one can play Kai'Sa in that league. And this is in comparison to how you look at LCK or LPL Kai'Sas specifically, and I'm just it's a bit of a yikes. So it's really hard for me to get really high on 80 carries in any league when I'm so used to watching LPL 80 carries that my expectations are just so much higher. And I look at LCS, I'm like, it's fine. it is what it is.
Yeah. So the jump in performance, to go to an FBI but pay $5 more in this game compared to a King is just not justifiable.
It's not worth it. Like maybe I know Ezreal's like really starting to take off because he's so good with what is it, Sunder or whatever the item's called.
Sunder,
And Ezreal's such a tricky champion whenever he's in meta because he really can expose. And I know that there's like two opinions of this. People will be like, how can my 80 carry mess up when he has a flash every like 9 seconds or whatever? This is like the ultimate noob-proof champion to keep him safe. But when you watch a really talented Ezreal versus like someone who just happens to play that champion because he's strong now, like it's night and day difference. And so if I'm comparing watching an Uzi level Ezreal performance, I'm like, there's a long ways to go. I did like watching Tactical on it. I know that he made a couple of mistakes, but his lane phase in his first game with Core on Karma, even though I hate Core JJ on Karma, he's not a bad Karma player. I just prefer him on engaged champions.
Yeah, completely agree.
Yeah, and then Tactical got styled on by Lost, I think.
Yeah. Tactical is another player who I think has come this year. He's come to be defined by a couple of memorable mistakes. And I'm just...
Why does that happen?
I don't know. Well, I mean, I think it's partly... I don't know how much this happens in other leagues, but I think people are ready to jump on anything in the LCS negatively and snowball it.
That's so weird because like Larson literally launched himself into the enemy nexus in like a game that would have in a super important game. He packaged himself into the spawn, and like while it is still sometimes a meme moment, more people recognize Larson for how talented he is as a mid laner. Yeah. So I agree with you. I think there is like sticking points for negative elements of LCS players, and I'm not really sure why. I don't know if it's like a broadcasting thing, it's a fandom thing, if it feels like it's a feedback loop of we never do well at international events, so that way it justifies all the players. But like, don't get me wrong, in every league there are some stinkers, especially in LPL, LEC. It's not just an LCS thing, but you also got your gyms, and there are plenty of gyms in LCS.
Yeah, for sure. Before we move on for a second here, I'll share a couple of other lineups that people put together, notable figures. So Freak did one. He did Fudge, Kenvi, Abbedagge, Sven, and Huhi. So he spent big in mid and bot lane and top to bring in Kenvi, the $1 jungler, the rookie, who I assume will be in LCS next year. He better be. And then Azael also put one out. He did Someday, Dardoch, Jensen, who is probably the most commonly picked mid laner at $3, and then a Sven Vulcan, expensive bot lane. So, go out. As I said, I'll put that in the show notes. You can play around with it, have some discussions. It's fun. But why don't we wrap things up here with some questions that listeners submitted. So this is something that people can do on Patreon, patreon.com/oracleselixir, when I announce the guest in advance, and you can put some questions in. So we've got a few here. And maybe we'll try not to dwell on them for too long, but I think they're pretty interesting. So Chris Zach, first of all, asked, from your perspective, how many League of Legends casters have pursued degrees in broadcasting that you've seen? Do you think more people are pursuing post-secondary education as a way to start esports careers?
I think that it's starting to happen more, but none of the casters that I know of have any sort of degree or background in broadcasting. A lot of producers do, but none of the casters themselves. I always like to joke that especially for kind of like this generation of league casters, that we were nerds and then we were just taught broadcast skills, and so we were leveled that way. I wonder if it will change in the future. I think so I had a conversation a lot where my belief is that Riot would have to really change how they were making flow systems or development systems, which is why I'm really happy to see that the LEC is pulling up more on the EU Masters casters. Yeah. As a caster that cast in a smaller region like OPL and LPL at the time, and then would get to go to events like MSI Worlds, you grow and level up so much more being around like the big premier broadcast. Like I got infinitely better in the short time of doing reps at MSI and Worlds than the millions of reps that I was doing domestically in LPL or OPL. And so I think that is just so important. But how to say this? the training systems aren't quite built out yet, and I think LEC got really, really fortunate that someone like Cadril came along, and perhaps Blippo. Like, you have these pro players that work really well on broadcast because the payment isn't equal. Like, maybe you have a pro player that decides that they're okay taking the pay cut to become a caster and have a more stable, laid-back lifestyle, and they can supplement income in other ways. But most of the time, it's like, why would you ever get a pro player to go onto broadcast and become the next caster when, especially in LCS, where streaming money can be so big, especially with co-streaming, or you become a coach, or you go to an academy system, like, you take a huge pay cut. The casters are not earning anywhere near what players and coaches and analysts are making. So that would be my big thing, which is why we haven't seen more pro players retiring and turning into casters. It's why the pro players are going into other positions. And of course, there's like, they want to compete in all of those things. Yeah. So I think LEC got super fortunate with Cadril. Hopefully they get really fortunate with Blippo if he does decide to retire in the future. But I think until Riot really decides to either create a better system where they're training up casters from like the grassroots area, they're going to run into trouble where eventually the casters will get old, they'll retire, they'll move on, and there won't be fresh new ones to come in. And I think that's happened a couple of times where you're seeing a pinch, especially in like the LCK, the LPL, where there aren't enough casters. Like, there's a ton of games to be cast right now, and these broadcasts can definitely be padded out more.
Yeah, for sure. And I think you might see in the future, if you do get a lot of aspirational, a lot of people aspiring to become casters, like I'm just trying to think of situations where post-secondary education might become valuable here, and I think generally it's not going to be the primary way in. But the only situation I think where it really would is if you have so many people aspiring to this and the competition's really there, and then it's a way to differentiate, right? Like, if you can come in with a higher baseline, then maybe it differentiates you. But I think esports is still young, and casting is still young, relatively speaking, as a profession, that coming in with a brand and subject matter knowledge and all these kinds of things are more important than the technical skills you add on top of that. So the next question was from Mojo, who would like to know who your biggest what-if player would be. So defining this as a player who maybe didn't get a chance, didn't land in a really good position to succeed, and maybe if they had been in the right opportunity, they could have really become something special.
I guess I'll do two, and I'll kind of do the two different extremes. So the first one that I'll say, well, for the longest time, it was SOFM. I thought that SOFM was ridiculously talented in the fact that he'd never made a world championship before. I was like, this is crazy because this guy is so good. But now he's finally had like his what if answered, and it feels good. So now I'll go Upset. I was trying to figure out if Upset had made a world championship. I think he hasn't, and if he has, it was probably just very, very brief, but I'm fairly certain that he's always just been denied, and I think that he's ridiculously talented and just the most unlucky career. Like, oh my lord. He joins Fnatic to replace Reckless as Fnatic combust internally. I'm like, this poor dude. This is really rough. And ridiculously talented, so I think the people that the player that people would really expect to fit into like very solid definition of like the what if player would be Upset. The one that I think people will really be surprised about is Perks, because Perks has achieved so much. He's won titles now in multiple regions,
Yep.
He's won an MSI title as one of the only Western players. He's swapped roles. He's won titles in multiple different roles. But the thing is, and I love this, imagine if G2 win Worlds without Perks. Like, how good is that story from both perspectives of a guy who gives up everything? He traded positions. He did everything he could to lift this team up, and he was so close that at like the final hurdle he runs into the team that eventually wins the world championship, you know, just like that type of denial. And what if he never wins it? And like the sacrifice that he made, I think that is such a compelling storyline, in the same way that if he had, in fact I think it's even a better story if he doesn't win it. Like Perks to me is just the most exciting player, and I think he just has the most incredible story. And it's a shame right now to kind of see his slump in performance, although I think kind of very expected right now. But I love Perks, and I love his story, and I think just this idea of, when we think about like the greatest Western player of all time, I know that like Perks' name comes up, but for me, like, it absolutely is Perks, even if he never wins it. Like, even if his career just, like, takes an absolute nosedive from here on out, I'm like, that is so, so good. Like, that's the movie that I want. Even more so than if he had stayed with Caps and they had won the world championship. And yay, hurrah.
Yeah, and the last question we had, I think, was kind of answered within this, but Angus Lockhart was wondering, you know, you were saying that for a long time, Knight was known as the best player who had never been to Worlds. And it sounds like you might put Upset into that place now. Is there any other player, or would you put Upset? Would that be your answer for that question, Alec? The best player to never make Worlds?
It'd probably be an LPL player, but I'm trying to think. So the thing is like, Name made Worlds, and I know that this has been breaking the question, but I think when Name made Worlds, because he got so sick and he had such a terrible performance, that people never really understood how good Name was, and I think that would be my my statement. Name was the best AD carry for a long time in the world, and no one really knows it because no one watched him at his best. And then when he went to the World Championship, he had the absolute most .A performance that you could ever imagine, and it's just so tragic. And then he just disappeared. And oh man, to see him in his prime, it's crazy because people will always put like Uzi up there as like the godfather of ADCs. Like, this is not a slam or slight on Uzi, but domestically, Uzi would run it. Like, so many times when you're just like, there he goes, Vayne spotting again. Yes, here we go. But internationally, he popped off, and he was always like good domestically, like one of the best domestically. And then he would have his moments where, especially more recently in the end of his career, where he was just the best domestically and internationally. But when you had Wei Xiao, Name, and Uzi, and I think Deft at the time and Imp all competing in the same league, Name was just incredible. I don't think Deft and Name got to compete, because I think Deft ultimately replaced Name, but like Imp, Wei Xiao, and Uzi were there, and Name was just out of control good. And so that would be mine. He made a world championship. No one ever really remembers it. It was 2014. It was a real bad look, but that was the player that no one ever really got to experience as good as he really was.
So it's a bit of a what if story as well, in a way. For sure. I'm looking at, say, some of the top LPL teams who are likely to go to Worlds this year, and like players on them who haven't been before. And I think the name that jumps out at me, because I think it pretty much, like, Viper's been to Worlds, right?
Yeah, with Griffin.
Yeah, but Flandre hasn't.
Flandre went last year with
Did he?
No, he didn't.
I don't think he did.
Has Flandre not been to Worlds?
I don't think he has.
Surely he's been to Worlds.
I believe he has not. But he was playing on pretty terrible teams for a long time.
So my best story about Flandre is he had to play in a tournament that Tencent ran, and Tencent was like, we can have 5 best of 5s in a single day. Like, that's totally fine. And it was a gauntlet. And Snake with Flandre started in the bottom, and so he had to play something like 20 games to get to the end. And in the very last game, they lost. And, like, you see pictures of them. Like, not only did the casters get wrecked because we're like, oh, God, make it stop. But, like, Flandre and Crystal looked shattered. And there's a really famous photo that the manager of Snake is carrying Flandre away, and like they happen to walk underneath a spotlight, and the photo's in black and white, and literally he has to like drag this poor kid's body away. Like Flandre's feet are being dragged, and he's just like, he's so exhausted. Like they tried so hard to go to Worlds, and at the very end they were cut down. But he should go with EDG this year. Yeah.
They're in a very good position for it, so maybe he's the player who holds that title right now. Him, Upset, might be able to throw in a comment on the VOD to anybody who's watching if you think it's another player who deserves that title. But this has been great. I think covered a lot of different topics in a lot of different ways, and it's been very fascinating. Run a little over length, which is great, and I don't mind that at all.
I'm so sorry.
Really appreciate you joining me on the show today, Froskurinn. What's the best way for people to follow along with the work you're doing right now?
Twitch.tv/G4TV. I'll be doing a lot of esports coverage with Golden Boy, Ovally, and me. I don't know why I put in an and there. We're trying to make the Comedy Central, the SNL, the John Oliver of esports coverage, and we haven't figured out the format yet. We're going through a lot of like different experimental things, but I think that it's a really nice niche for content for esports to exist in. So if you're interested, that's where to find us.
Great. Definitely include the link for that. And for everyone listening, thank you very much for following along. You can support the True Sight podcast at patreon.com/oracleselixir. You can subscribe to the show on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, as well as anchor.fm/TrueSight. And make sure you check out the Oracle's Elixir Discord server to talk about LoL esports, data science, a lot of other topics. And links for all of those will be in the show notes as well. This has been the True Sight podcast, and I'm Tim Sevenhusen. Thanks for listening.